So let me just go through, and Lindsay, I'm going to have you advance the slides, actually. You don't have to turn the presenter mode over to me, so I'll let you go forward. So this is our first group, our meeting as a group, which I'm thrilled about. If there are things that the families want to do in terms of either something like this in the future, please give us some feedback afterwards. We'd love to hear about what's working, what's not working. If at any point you think that it would be useful to actually physically get together, let us know. We'd be interested in that as well. We did think this was going to be a useful way to do this because, as you can tell, we have a lot of families from around the world, and we know how expensive and difficult and time-consuming it is to travel, so we thought this would be a great way to get started. So this is the first sort of iteration of this, but I hope it's not going to be the last. Many of you have been incredibly generous in terms of contributing some information about your children to the Simons VIP project. So the first thing we're going to be doing today is actually showing that information back to you. And again, we're going to be posting all of this. This is just the first freeze of the data, if you will, the first look at the data with whoever's contributed data so far. But we hope this is something that continues to grow over time. And as you'll see, there are some limitations in terms of what we know, and I'll try and point those things out, but it is certainly a growing data set. And I should point out that the information that you've contributed has been de-identified, so I'm not going to be identifying any one person through any of the presentations today. And in general, any of the information that you've contributed, again, is not personally identifying. In other words, it doesn't say your name or your child's name or anything that can be personally identifying, and it is freely available to researchers around the world. So what we hope to do by this mechanism is to minimize the burden on you all as families to be able to participate in research, but yet to get as many researchers around the world interested in GRIN2B as possible. You'll see that we've got two main speakers today, myself as well as Barbara. Within each or after each one of these, we're going to have time for questions. And if you're having any trouble with your audio, unmuting yourself, feel free to go in the chat box and be able to send Lindsay a question. As she said, I'm not going to be watching those questions coming in, but she'll present them in the Q&A, the question and answer period later. At the end of the presentation, we're going to drop off. So any of us that introduced ourselves as being associated with Simons VIP or researchers or any of us, Barbara, any of us that are not families, we're all going to drop off the call. We're going to keep the line open though, and that way if any of you all as families want to be talking about anything, you can feel free. We're going to keep the line open for an hour afterwards, so you can feel free to talk as much as you want. It's just, I think, an easy opportunity if you all have things you want to discuss. That will not be recorded. So anything after the end of Barbara's questions, we will stop the recording, we'll announce that, and you can feel free to use that time. I am personally, number one, thankful for all the questions that came in terms of some of the things that you were hoping we'd be able to address. I will say that we don't have answers to all of your questions yet at this point. These are still, from my point of view, relatively early days in understanding GRIN2B, but I will try and interject some comments, at least as I understood the questions that came in. And again, if you have questions at the end, we'll save some time for that. As we do this, again, I know I've said this, but I do want to emphasize that it's still very early days, and so there are a lot of things that we don't know. But one of the things I'm interested in hearing is what are the sort of top challenges or top questions that you all as families have. I've already, just in the brief introductions, been hearing about the, seizures, I think, are one issue, and who has seizures, who doesn't have seizures. And we do have some opportunities within the research to be able to prioritize the questions or address the questions that you all have. I mean, this is really your research study in many ways. So if it doesn't come up in the questions and answers today, please, please, please send in either to myself, to Jennifer Trinagel, to Lindsay, to anyone at the Geisinger team. If there are priorities that you all have in terms of questions, concerns, things to address, please let us know, because we're trying to really just be an organized way of being able to, for you as families, address the questions that are important. And I will say that you're the most important people out there because you're the ones that obviously know what's important, you know what the things are that you haven't figured out for yourselves, and we just hope that we're the facilitators for that. So next slide. So getting into this, and you can go to the next slide, Lindsay. As we're doing this, we're going to review some of the genetics. I'm going to do this relatively briefly, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page. We're going to review the medical information that you've been sending in. We'll talk a little bit about the biology and hopefully what goes on in research with rare conditions like GRIN2B, and not just for those of us that are on the line, but trying to show you or tell you a little bit about what other people are doing, other types of researchers are doing out there. And then we're going to put in just a couple slides about gene therapy, because it's questions that I often get asked, and I'll try and bring you up to date in terms of what we can do now, and then answer your questions. Next slide. So as we go through this, just very briefly, all of you are on this call because you had some sort of genetic test that told you that GRIN2B was what was going on with your child. Within this, there's a lot of information in our genetic code. Many of you had either exome or genome sequencing that identified GRIN2B. There are a few of you, I think, that probably had a number of genes looked at that were associated with either with epilepsy or neurodevelopmental problems, but one way or another, you had some sort of genetic test that identified GRIN2B. Next slide. As we did this, I think it's the case for everyone on the phone, but I can't swear to it because I don't necessarily, again, know who you are. But within these, it is mostly the case that GRIN2B genetic variants are new in the child with the challenges. So what I mean by that is that for most, if not all of you, the GRIN2B in your child was not something inherited from either parent, but something that started brand new with the child. This is not something that any of you had control over. So moms, this was not anything you did in terms of having a glass of wine before you realized you were pregnant, or missing a day of prenatal vitamins, or the flu or the cold you had. This was nothing that you caused, that did to cause this, or didn't do that caused this. We do know that for every single one of us, on average, out of our 3 billion alphabet letters of our genetic information, each of our children has, on average, about 100 new genetic changes. Now, even our children without neurodevelopmental challenges also have some of these changes, but for everyone on this call, the reason why we're united is because one of those changes just happened by chance to fall within GRIN2B, and because of that had effects in terms of how the brain is functioning, and in some cases with epilepsy. So again, this is nothing anyone did to cause this. In most cases, when this change happens, for those of you that are thinking about having other children, the chance that the GRIN2B will show up again is less than 1%. It's technically not zero, because there's a small possibility that some of the other either egg cells or sperm cells could have the GRIN2B, but the chance of this happening again is, in my mind, very low. Not zero, but very low. For those of you who have other children besides your child with GRIN2B, if they don't have any signs of either developmental problems or seizures, especially if they're over the age of 2, it is very, very likely, very, very, very likely, I should say, that they don't have GRIN2B, and as well that their children will not have GRIN2B. So once they get big and grow up and have their own families, this really usually is only an issue for the child with the GRIN2B. Next slide. So within this, as I said, this is something that we usually think of as a new change either in the egg or the sperm, or in some cases very shortly after those have gotten together. Just from your genetic test, we can't know which of those 3 it was, but again, it's not really so important, simply that the chance of it happening again in a future pregnancy is very low. Next slide. So as we did this, the information we're reporting on today is from all of the families that were registered on Simon's VIP. As many of you know that went through this process, it involved signing a consent form, being able to give your genetic test report to us to review and make sure that in fact the GRIN2B was the right club. And then for those of you who talked with Ashley on the telephone, went through your medical history, we had a few families that hadn't quite gotten to that point. So we've got 25 families registered so far, and I'm going to be talking about the information from 18 of the families. Now with that, I want you to realize that a few things. So the ages of the individuals that were registered that I'm talking about range from basically a year of age to 17 years of age. To me, that's good that we have kids across a wide range of ages, but I also want you to know that at least right now, we don't have, for instance, adults with GRIN2B that are in this study. And so one of the limitations in this is that we surely don't know exactly how this falls through the entire lifespan, and then there's potential that there could be changes over time. We saw a few more boys than girls. I don't exactly know why that is right now in terms of how we think about how this gene works. I would have expected that eventually we'll see as many boys as girls with this. So I think it's just basically the luck of, small numbers, a small sample size at this point. One of the things is that I think even though the group is, I would say a modest size group for, the fact that we've only known about GRIN2B for a little time, I'm sure there are many, many more people with GRIN2B out there who simply don't know that. And for many of your children who are either in, receiving therapy or special needs classrooms, I'm sure there are many other children that are in those types of communities or in those types of settings. If they don't have GRIN2B, may have GRIN2A or even other genes that are like this. It's simply that I'll give you a lot of credit, for whatever reason you managed to get the genetic testing. And this is still very early in terms of families getting access to this. So there are many more individuals out there with this that simply don't know it. On the other hand, I don't think this is incredibly common. I don't think it's anything like 1 in 50 people have this. My guesstimate, even though it is just a guesstimate at this point, is it may be something like 1 in 50,000 to 1 in 100,000 people that are born have GRIN2B. But we shall see over time. Next slide. So this is the actual information about the GRIN2B that each of you had that reported this. And I know this looks like just a bunch of letters and numbers, but I'm going to try and walk you through just a little bit of this. So for most of the individuals who are represented in the research study, you had what we call missense genetic variants. And so what that is that I'll just walk you through the nomenclature here. There is one amino acid followed by a number, followed by another amino acid. So that first amino acid, I'll just take that top line, is an asparagine at position 694. So an amino acid is a building block in the protein. So within the GRIN2B protein, if you look and count into the 694th amino acid, instead of having an asparagine at that position, there is a serine in that position. And for the purposes of our discussion, I don't think we have to get much deeper in terms of understanding what that means, but it's a relatively subtle, relatively, it doesn't completely destroy at least the gene. The gene is still there, the protein is still there. So that's one thing I want you to notice on this. Even more important, perhaps, is that the column on the right, the number of individuals, you'll see that with the exception of one of those changes, glycine 820 alanine, with that one exception, every other change, we see only one person. So in other words, this is still, again, relatively early days, but for most of you, your child is unique. That is that, at least as far as we know so far, we're not seeing, oh, I'm getting a notice here. Just a note, I believe there are 4 individuals with glycine 689 serine. I'm sure that whoever just wrote that, I'm sure that's correct. Just saying that at least within this cohort specifically. Again, someone tell me if there's different knowledge, but at least to my knowledge, what we've got in Simon's VIP, we have only one person with that. But thank you for the correction. So within this, though, you'll see that there's quite a range in terms of the different amino acids that are represented. And so with that, there may be some differences, both in terms of severity. There may be that some of these changes are more severe or less severe than others. So as you're comparing notes with each other, it may not be that everyone's going to be impacted the same exact way. In addition to that, besides GRIN2B, there are other factors that ultimately determine how the children are doing. So in other words, other things that may, either other genetic factors, other things that we're doing in terms of their treatment, their medical treatment, their seizure treatments, other things in terms of the therapies that they're getting. So I don't want you to think that it's all bound up within this GRIN2B change. There are a couple individuals, and I'll just say, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th line down, for instance. There are the 6th line down and the 8th line down. There are a couple individuals who have different changes that probably essentially eliminate one of the 2 copies of the GRIN2B. Those are particular changes that we think of them as, or at least as geneticists, I can say we think of them as probably eliminating functionally one copy of that gene. Each of us have 2 copies of the GRIN2B gene. For all of your children that have GRIN2B, they have 1 copy of the gene that we think is working perfectly normally, and another copy of the gene that has this change. So one of the good things is, and one of the things ultimately I think we try and think of therapeutically, is how can we keep the good copy of the gene working and then potentially compensate for the copy of the gene that's not working so well, if at all. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to go through and then just briefly, I'm going to give you kind of a high-level summary, and then I'm going to go back and go through kind of line by line the details of this. So the first thing is in terms of the individuals that have been involved in Simon CIP, the one thing that connects everyone, so every single person within the study so far has had some sort of manifestation when it comes to the brain. So with this, as we're looking through this, everyone has had some sort of challenge. Depending on their age, we may have classified it as intellectual disabilities, and that's because there are some things where just based on their age, we may not get a very good measure of this. For the younger children, we'll often call this developmental delay because they're delayed in their development, their neurological development. And then in some cases, when they're old enough, we know that it's not just simply a matter of delays, but it's essentially a primary problem. Within this, so that's what's consistent among everyone, is being able to see everything there, or rather being able to see something with the brain for everyone. In other dimensions, as we think about other, whether they be medical problems or other things, I'd say number one is that we don't see it consistently. So we don't see that there's consistently, as I'll go through it in a little bit, that everyone has the same challenge. But I'll say that in general, they tend not to be serious medical problems. The seizures are one exception, and I'm counting that in terms of the brain challenges. But otherwise, in terms of the other medical issues, this tends to be really from the shoulders above where we see most of the issues. Not all of them, but most of them. So that's the first point that I want to make. When we break this down into different manifestations within the brain, the types of delays that we see are certainly issues in terms of speech or expressive language, and also understanding. We call that receptive language, so that continues to be a challenge. Not everyone, but certain individuals will have a diagnosis of autism. More commonly, I think they may have maybe one behavior that we see sometimes in individuals with autism, but certainly I would say that it's the minority of individuals who have an official diagnosis of autism. There may be other behaviors, though, that we see, and some of these are age-related, so we may see them as the children get older, but again, not consistently. And some of these behaviors include attention deficit or hyperactivity. And again, that's the last line, certainly not everyone. Just so you know, I'm not watching all the pop-ups, but I did see very briefly that some individuals may say that they didn't see their mutation listed on the last line, and we can go into it with you on detail. It may be, again, that not everyone got to the point of providing enough of their data to get into this data freeze, or it may be that you may not be recognizing it because there are a couple different ways that we refer to in terms of either what we call nucleotide or the amino acid. So we'll be glad to go over anyone who seems like they're not included within this and try and make sure that we do have your data included for other, to get the data information out there to others. Next slide. So as we're doing this now, I'm going to transition over to some of the medical issues. And again, primarily, I guess what I'm relieved and very pleased to say is that, these are certainly things that I'm not dismissing them. I'm not saying they're real, but thankfully we haven't been seeing, I don't think, significant life-threatening problems. For instance, the most serious of the medical issues have really been related to the seizures. So within this, in the neonatal period, there have been jaundice or yellowing of the skin that sometimes will require lights or phototherapy to clear that up, but that did clear up very nicely, very easily. A couple of the children were in the neonatal intensive care unit, and one of them had problems in terms of breathing meconium down the windpipe. But thankfully, not what I would call serious prolonged conditions in the newborn period. Next slide. As we went through this, we did, however, start to notice some things, or you all started to notice some things that may be a little bit different. So This is obviously in retrospect, but thinking about it, several of the children really almost immediately after birth had problems in terms of maybe they weren't eating the best, they weren't sucking, they weren't either latching onto the nipple or able to eat as quickly or as coordinated as other children. They were noted to have low tone, low muscle tone, so they may have felt a little bit looser in your arms. And some of the parents were reporting that they may have been more fussy, more irritable, either having more like colicky symptoms or other things. Next slide. So some of the things that you or your neurologist were noticing as well, and again, these are not mutually exclusive, so one child could have had multiple manifestations. Low muscle tone was the most consistent problem, but some of the children were noted to have at least parts of the body that also had high muscle tone or hypertonia. Interesting to me that we didn't see a consistent either small or large head size. And in fact, it may be that most of the children are simply of average head size in general. One child was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. In retrospect, now knowing the GRIN2B, my guess is it's the GRIN2B perhaps that was responsible and actually what led to the symptoms that led to the diagnosis of GRIN2B. And some of the parents were noticing that their children were clumsy or maybe not as coordinated. Next slide. One of the things that at least from hearing some of the families, that I think may be an area to think a little bit more deeply about is this question of seizures or epilepsy. Within this, it's clearly not the case that every single child is having seizures or epilepsy, but it is a significant concern when your child is having those seizures or epilepsy. GRIN2B is a little bit, I guess I'm going to come back to a point that I made before, that the genetic mutations, the specific genetic change within GRIN2B, I think one area potentially to focus on for the researchers is going to be trying to make some correlations between what the actual GRIN2B change is and how that's related to the seizure manifestations. Let me just say very briefly, and I think many of the families already know this, GRIN2B stands for, when you spell this out, it's the glutamate receptor, and it's in the brain, it's expressed in the brain, and it's related to a channel or an opening that allows different, what we call electrolytes or ions, into the brain, in and out of the brain cells, and that ultimately allows brain cells to connect to each other and talk to each other through what we call synapses. Synapses are those connections from one brain cell to the next cell. And so with these, this is allowing connection with what are called NMDA receptors to be able to allow those channels, those ions, to be able to allow the flux of things like sodium and other ions in and out of the brain cells to connect with each other. Again, there may be even differences between the GRIN2B gene either having what we call a gain or a loss of function, that is either not working, not doing its job as well, or in some cases working, almost you can think of it as working overtime, but there may be some differences in that, and they may not be obvious to us simply by looking at your genetic test reports to be able to see what the exact amino acid is that's changed. And so I do think there are some rich areas of opportunity for researchers to now start going deeper into understanding some of those specific amino acid changes and how those are related to the specific symptoms. Next slide. One of the other issues with seizures sometimes, and I'll just say one more thing before I start talking about vision, but one of the things, as I said, is that the children still range quite a bit in age, and one other possibility is that things could change over time. So one thing I just want folks to keep an eye on is that adolescence, or as children start to go through puberty, is a time where sometimes, even if a child hasn't had seizures before, they may come up then. I think it's too early to know for GRIN2B what's going to happen all the time, but it is a period of time that I just want to make folks aware of, that with other either seizure conditions or other forms of neurodevelopmental issues, we may see seizures for the first time at that age period. So just keep an eye on that. Just a couple other points about the seizures is that there are different types of seizures. There's some where you actually have convulsions that you can see and observe. It looks like shaking. It may be the arms or the legs moving. It may be that the eyes roll up either to the back of the head or roll up to the left or the right. Sometimes you can see twitching, either twitching of the lips. And it may be in some cases that it may not be obvious to you whether your child is having a seizure. If you do have the ability on your phone for either you or someone else to take a quick video when it happens, that's something that can be helpful to show your neurologist, to show your pediatrician, show one of your doctors, so that they can see what you're seeing and to be able to help better interpret that. If they're concerned about seizures, if they're concerned that that might be a possibility, if you haven't had it already, they'll oftentimes have you come in for an electroencephalogram or an EEG. That's when they'll put the electrodes on the head. Oftentimes they will do that overnight or often over 24 or 48 hours to give a prolonged period of time when they can see that. And oftentimes they're doing it with a video attached, so they can be watching what's happening at the same time they're watching those electrical brain waves and seeing if any of that is correlated, seeing if at the time when, for instance, you might be seeing some twitching or some staring, being able to see if that correlates with any of the EEG changes. I will say that if you're concerned about that, then it's a good thing to bring that attention to the attention of your doctor, because if there are seizures, it's important to get that checked out, to get that treated, and to make sure that that's not an issue. I would say that the seizures are frequent enough that I think it's a good idea for every one of the children with the GRIN2B to actually get that checked out with their neurologist. You can either be a general child neurologist or an epileptologist, but just to see whether that really is there or is not there. And if that's the case, when they do that, they may bring you into the hospital to do that over 24 hours so that they can also do this during sleep, so that they can see if there's something while your child is sleeping where they can see if those brain waves change. Because obviously you may not be, sort of watching your child sleep all during the night to see if any of these changes are happening. So again, in terms of take-home messages, that is one of the important points I wanted to bring out, is just making sure that families are aware of the seizure potential. And again, it's an important thing to get checked out with. Okay, so going on then, some of the problems that we can see with vision. Some of these, I think, are reflecting some of the things that we can see with the brain. The brain are connected to the eyes. And so one of the things that 2 of you reported were that your children had cortical blindness. So I just want to bring your attention to that. That's actually a problem with the part of the brain that's working with the eyes. So the cortex, or a part of the brain, and that's where cortical comes from. It's actually that back part of the brain that's working with the eyes to see. There were some other eye problems directly with the eyes. Oftentimes this was a lazy eye or strabismus that some of you saw, or eyes that were kind of wiggling, nystagmus that can be seen. So different things that were not necessarily, or not problems necessarily that just glasses would have fixed. Strabismus sometimes can require even some surgery to be able to take care of that. Some of you noted things like being able to see better near or far away, so being farsighted or nearsighted with that, or a droopy eyelid or ptosis. So again, some technical medical terms for those different things. But again, my suggestion would be that if you haven't had your child's eyes checked, it's a good thing to do. The reason that I say that, and if you can get it checked out by a pediatric ophthalmologist, and the reason I say that is because your children need to have all of their senses working the best way possible. That is to be able to see the world accurately, to be able to hear the world accurately, to be able to get all that information into the brain in a clear and accurate way so that they can learn and so that their brain can be developing. So again, not that these are necessarily terrible problems in many cases, but important, if any correction needs to be done, that it is corrected so that your children can grow up seeing the world clearly. Next slide. So in addition to that, when we think about some of the other medical issues, Again, very common that we see this among children with neurodevelopmental challenges, are some things that have to do with the digestive system or the intestines. So in the same way that the children's muscle tone can be low in their arms or their legs, their muscle tone can effectively be low within their intestine as well. And when that happens, there's actually a muscle that's right above the stomach that keeps things from coming back up, so in the stomach and coming back up to the tube going from the mouth to the stomach. And so that can be, they can manifest or they can feel that as heartburn or reflux, things refluxing or coming back up from the stomach. And again, it's because of low muscle tone. In the same way, there are muscles throughout the intestinal system that keep things moving along. And when those don't move things along very quickly, it can result in constipation. In some cases, it can also result in diarrhea, but more oftenly constipation. And in fact, that was something that you were reporting that you saw more frequently. Again, this is something that can often be helped with medication, but it's something that can feel quite uncomfortable. And it's hard for the children to be able to express this and say what's going on. So I would have sort of a high index of suspicion of some of these things. And again, bring it to the attention of your pediatrician or gastroenterologist because there are some effective medications that can work for this. Next slide. Infections in terms of things, I would say, and I know one of the families had asked about this, in general, we're not seeing significant problems with what I would call immunodeficiencies or severe immunological problems. I would say, at least in my experience, we're seeing about the average amount of either ear infections or pneumonia or lung infections. But I do want to emphasize again that for the ear infections, I think it's really important to get those cleared up. So to be able to either get antibiotics when it's necessary, or if these ear infections are happening many times, then ear tubes can be helpful to be able to drain the fluid out of the ears and keep the children able to hear. Otherwise, if you've ever thought about being underwater and talking underwater, it's hard to hear clearly, and we don't want anything to get in the way of language development for the children. Next slide. In addition to that, I would say the lung problems that we were hearing are about average for most children. They didn't tend to be consistent across individuals. Asthma is relatively common in children. And again, a couple children that had pneumonia or lung infections. But again, I don't think this is something based on this gene that's having a primary effect on the lungs. It could have a problem if children are swallowing the wrong way. If things go down the windpipe instead of into the intestine, that could be a risk. And so that is something to just be aware of with your pediatrician. Next slide. Again, in terms of other problems, we did have one child with kidney stones. Kidney stones at this age is a little unusual, so it is something I wanted to bring attention to the group. It's not very common and might have nothing to do with GRIN2B, but I will say they can be quite painful. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that sometimes the children will not be able to express exactly what's going on, but they may be quite, if it is quite painful, just keep that in mind, and it's something that they can easily do an ultrasound to be able to look at in your child if that's an issue. Next slide. With this, some of the children in terms of growth problems have been something that, again, haven't necessarily been, consistent with all the children. Many of the children will have some problems at some age, but especially when they're young in terms of gaining weight. I would say we haven't consistently seen problems in terms of either hyper or high levels of thyroid hormone or hypo, low levels of thyroid hormone, but there do seem to be a few children with thyroid issues and one child with diabetes. So again, not extremely consistent, but there are things that can be done, especially for the weight gain. So if that's a challenge, certainly discuss this with your pediatrician in terms of either supplemental feeds or other things to help from a nutritional status. We definitely want the children to get the nutrition they need to be strong enough. Okay, next slide. With the bone issues, one of the things that we do more commonly see, and I would say this is especially in adolescence or as the children go into puberty, is scoliosis or curvature of the spine. So many of your children aren't old enough for that yet, but it is important to keep an eye on that. Children with low muscle tone generally can have increased risk of that. They don't necessarily need to have surgery or braces, but some of them will. So do keep an eye on that because it's important as they go into adulthood. Some of them can have problems with their hips, and the pectus excavatum is something that's with the chest muscles or the rib cage. Again, not very common, but something that your pediatrician can keep an eye on. Next slide. In terms of surgeries, again, the children did have what I think of as some more common surgeries that we see with children with neurodevelopmental problems. The children that were having trouble growing or nutritional problems with feeding and problems getting enough nutrition have had gastrostomy tubes placed or tubes going straight into their tummy to help with feeding. Those don't have to stay for life, and so if they're helpful, that's something that can be helpful to just maximize nutrition. The ear tubes or the PE tubes are something, again, that many of the children had, and at the same time, their doctors may have taken out their tonsils or the adenoids, and certainly if they're going to do that, doing that all at the same time is good. The eye surgery is something that can be done for strabismus, and most of the others, I think, are things that are relatively or not unusual for children, hernia repairs or a broken bone. Next slide. Okay, some of the skin findings I think were relatively common. So acne obviously is relatively common. Eczema or problems that some children can have where their skin gets very dry and itchy. And so, you know, the regular treatment, nothing particularly special about that. Or sometimes birthmarks that we saw, either blood vessel birthmarks called hemangiomas, or these things that may be a little patch where it looks a little bit darker, a cafe au lait spot. Again, none of these I don't think are specific to GRIN2B, and none of them, at least to my knowledge, have been particularly sort of needed unusual treatments to support them. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of the different types of medication, and again, I think this might be something that the group will want to do a deeper dive on, is now trying to think about what treatments and what's worked, or even perhaps what hasn't worked. So one of those is for seizures. Being able to keep seizures under control are oftentimes one of families' biggest concerns, and I would suggest might be an area for us to focus on in sort of the next wave of this, as well as medications for behavioral issues, either behavioral issues or attention issues. Those can all be helpful. As I said again, and I've seen just a little bit of the chatter going back and forth, constipation, sometimes Miralax, sometimes enemas, other things can be helpful for the constipation. Something else that oftentimes is kind of related to the behavioral medications, but sleep is something that's often an issue. Melatonin is oftentimes a very safe first medication to try in terms of things that might be useful. And Catapress is another medication that parents have used. And I do think it's very important for the children as much as possible to get a good night's sleep. If they get a good night's sleep, it also means you as parents get a good night's sleep. And just in general, it's the time when all of the things they've learned during the day are consolidated during sleep. And so it's important for them to consolidate their learnings during the day and to be able to wake up refreshed and ready for the next day. Okay, next slide. I know I'm going a little bit long, and I'm sorry about this, but I'll try and wrap this up now. And just to say that we've talked about these issues. The predominant thing I would say is from a developmental point of view, we have not been seeing that individuals are regressing. That is, that it doesn't appear as if the children are losing ground. The one thing I would be careful with, though, is if you seizures can oftentimes cause some sort of bumps in the road in terms of learning and progressing and developing forward. So there can be circumstances when seizures, if they are not under control, can cause issues with development. And that's part of why I said it's important to get that under control. But otherwise, the good news, so far as we know it, is that the children are basically medically doing well and making forward progress, just albeit I realize it's more challenges in terms of that. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to go relatively quickly through this, but to say that, as I said, there are a whole group of researchers out there that are thinking about GRIN2B from a very basic point of view to try and understand exactly how this is working in the brain, how this NMDA receptor channel, what its effects are. There's another kind of sister, GRIN2A, that actually has many features, many shared features with GRIN2B, and so there are people that are working on these together as a unit. We don't have any of those researchers on the line today, but it is, if the group is interested, I would suggest that's another possibility, is to bring some of those folks in the future. They are doing everything such as, for instance, trying to look at this in what we call cells in a dish. So to be able to do that as one model for how this works, also being able to have animal models, not mice in particular, to be able to study this and to be able to make some inroads. As I said, to me, one of the things that makes this a little bit more complicated is that there are several different changes within the GRIN2B, and to understand how all of those are working is going to require quite a bit of work. And even to work on just one genetic change in the gene is a lot of effort, and so it does get to be a little bit more complicated in that it's in some ways not just one condition, but many, many different conditions, all related, all very much united, but still quite a bit of work. And I just want to emphasize again, these are early days in terms of this. So some of you may have been hearing about things like gene therapy, and I'm just going to very briefly say that we're not there yet in terms of being able to therapeutically use this. It's great that we know that GRIN2B is what we need to focus our energy on, but we don't have a way of just flipping a switch and fixing this and making it better. Next slide. When we think about this in terms of, just to give you a sense of timeline for this, we definitely get better over this as time goes on to make sure that sort of people have learned from other research before that make it much more efficient going forward. But I put on here just as an example for one genetic condition that's much more common than GRIN2B. There for cystic fibrosis, for instance, there are now drugs that are specifically for cystic fibrosis, but it took about 25 years to get to that point. I hope we can decrease that time period to much less than 25 years for GRIN2B, but just to be patient. Researchers are working very hard on this. I think we can always use more researchers. I think we can always help them to learn better, faster, and make inroads faster, but it does take some time. Next slide. In terms of this, one of the things that I do think is exciting is that there are a huge army of people out there that are not just focused on GRIN2B, but they are focused on methods of gene editing, being able to, now that we know about the specific genetic change, being able to think about how to fix it. It's not trivial to do in the brain, especially, to be able to get it into all the cells that need it, but the sort of strategy for doing it in a very focused way, a very directed way, I can just say is infinitely better than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. So I do think, I'm very positive about being able to do this in a more precise way, but it's still not perfect yet. Next slide. In terms of thinking about this, what you all can do, and again, we're going to get off the phone so you guys can think about this. You've already self-organized very effectively. At some point, I know you'd share a lot of information on Facebook and being able to individually share with each other. Sometimes, and again, this is from the Simons VIP side, we've oftentimes found that being able to have families in the room with each other, and sometimes with researchers, you just learn a lot with sharing. And so I'll just encourage you to continue doing that. I am interested to understand from, some of what comes out of today, what are priority areas that we perhaps don't have enough information and are important gaps to fill. We certainly will come back with that. And then one thing that we're trying to do within Simons VIP specifically is to enable researchers to make more progress faster. And sometimes that will require actually samples from the families, either blood cells or skin cells, to be able to make models of the GRIN2B in the laboratory. Some of you have actually donated already to be able to do that, and that's fantastic because you only have to donate once. In doing that, we can make sure that this gets shared effectively with any researchers. For those of you who are overseas, again, this, or at least overseas from the U.S. point of view, this is not just for U.S. researchers. Any researchers in the world who can use this, we're glad to be able to help their work. Okay, is that the last of my slides in this section, Lindsay? Oh, I'm sorry, a little bit more as we're going through this. So as we're doing this, actually just back one slide. So as we're doing this, even though we don't have a cure for this yet, and I don't know how long it will be until we get there, I do hope that we can come up with best practices and be able to help inform your doctors and your therapists about this, be able to help even get insurance coverage for things that we do think are going to be helpful, have some guidelines that might help. Certainly give us some feedback about whether or not you think that's useful. But I think that's what I call the care until the cure, being able to hopefully put forth some evidence that will help you to be able to know what to look out for, and importantly, be able to help your doctors as well, or your doctors and your educators help with these things. Okay, so let me stop there. Lindsay, you can go to the next slide as a placeholder for this. I don't want to take up all of Barbara's time from this, and I apologize. I just wanted to make sure this was clear to everyone. But either Lindsay, if you can read out if you've been monitoring the chat, or Jennifer, if there's some questions that we haven't gone through as we've been as I've been narrating, let me know, and I will definitely try and answer the questions. I should have said just one other thing as you're queuing up those questions. With Spark, which was the last slide, is just to let the group know, we realize that there are not enough GRIN2B families out there. So one initiative we have, which is based in the US, is to have 50,000 families at least who have a diagnosis of autism, get access to the type of genetic testing that many of you had, that is exome sequencing. And we hope from that effort of those 50,000 families it'll probably take us a few more years to recruit all of them and sequence all of them, but hopefully that will actually identify even more GRIN2B families that can obviously join the efforts and the initiatives that you're part of. So that's part of what we're doing specifically at the Simons Foundation to try and hopefully identify more families. And I was remiss, Lindsay, if you can just go to the next slide. The one thing I did want to do is just to shout out, there are a lot of people that make the Simons VIP project work. Some of you have met them over the phone or by email, but just to put these pictures up here for a second while we take questions, because it's really all their work that I'm showcasing for you. Okay, now Lindsay, are there questions?
So I did get one specific question via chat, although there has been a ton of back and forth with the families. There was one person who would be interested to know if colon distension is common. Their son had chronic constipations and just wondered if the colon is distended and what they could do about it.
Yeah, so the colon distension, so number one, yes, I do think colon distension sort of as a secondary problem to the constipation is what can be seen. So in other words, when the children don't go, they get backed up and then the colon, expands to meet that. I don't think the colon necessarily starts out by being huge. That's something that we don't usually see. So I do think it's primarily treating the constipation. And I saw a little bit of things going back and forth. There are everything from, some people it's a change in diet that helps, some it's medications, Miralax, enema, stool softeners, Colace. There are a variety of different things. Prune juice, for some, or other things that help to bulk up the stool. There are various different strategies, and I don't know your children well enough to know what's been effective for you individually, but I don't think it requires any different type of treatment than most gastroenterologists are used to for treating constipation. So if it is a challenge, certainly, talk it over with even just your general pediatrician. Many times feels comfortable treating it, or a pediatric gastroenterologist. Okay, any other, and if anyone wants to even unmute their line, if there's a, really important point or burning question that you want to make, feel free.
Hi, it's Louise here. I was really quite interested to hear you say that it doesn't seem like there's any kind of regression. Our son is definitely regressing, and I've often wondered if it was related to the GRIN2B, but it seems that it's probably more because he's just having so many seizures. He's had about 600 seizures this year, and we just aren't getting anywhere with controlling them.
Okay, so thank you for that, Louise. I just want to make sure it was clear, because I realize it may not have been. So I think the seizures complicate matters. So I do think when seizures are not controlled, you can imagine it's like being in a constant electrical storm. There's just a lot going on the brain, and I do think there can be both problems in terms of stagnating, not progressing forward, as well as I think there can be When I say regression, what I mean is a child who had the ability to do something and then lost that ability, permanently lost the ability to whatever that skill might have been. So I do
Yes.
think seizures, uncontrolled seizures complicate that. So when I'm talking about the children not regressing, I'm talking about if there are no seizures, I haven't consistently, I haven't been seeing the children roll back.
Yes.
Again, if you're seeing regression, I do want to emphasize, and I would say even without seeing regression, I think it's useful to have a baseline EEG to know whether there are or not seizures there. And again, if there are, to work with your epileptologist to make sure those get the right kind of control.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is the seizures. I mean, he's had numerous EEGs and he's been on 17 different antiepileptics and he's had a corpus callosotomy, and we still don't have good control. And yeah, there's no denying regression in terms of his gross motor skills, fine motor skills, ability to play. We can look at video when he was 3 and he was more capable than he is now at 13. And everyone in his team acknowledges the regression. So it's just very interesting to hear that it's not thought to be an inherent part of GRIN2B, that it's more all the seizures that we just can't get under control.
Mm-hmm. And let me be clear, I think probably most of the families realize this, but I do think the seizures are caused by the GRIN2B. So in some ways,
yes,
it all stems back to the GRIN2B. But
yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Very good.
Wendy, it looks like there have been quite a few comments in here about overnight or 24-hour EEG. I know you mentioned that already in your presentation, but then someone, as far as insurance coverage and that kind of thing, I don't know if you had any other comments on that.
Right. So let me just briefly say this, and then I'll turn this over to Barbara because I don't want to cut her short on her talk. So for some of you, there are 2 different ways oftentimes that they'll do the seizure. So one, or rather EEG to monitor for seizures or to check for seizures. One is they'll do a spot, what they sometimes call a spot EEG. So they'll do this, oftentimes it's from anywhere from 30 to 240 minutes, but not where you're staying overnight in the hospital often, but they're kind of doing a short monitoring of the EEG. Another way that they do it is they'll do it overnight. They bring the child into the hospital, and it can be over a day or 2 days. It can be even longer, depending on their level of concern and how long they want to wait to try and capture a seizure. They'll oftentimes, as I said, do it with video monitoring. Sometimes they'll do things to try and provoke or bring out the seizure. Sometimes they'll deprive a child of sleep, kind of a little bit of torture, but do something to try and bring out the seizure. Because again, they want to, they can't do this forever. They can't, just have your child wired up in terms of monitoring them for months and months. So they want to try and do whatever they can to see it in the hospital. I do think that and again, part of at least my reason for this care until the cure mantra is that if we can see that we see this consistently enough, we'll be able to, for instance, go to doctors, go to insurance companies and say, yes, this is an important thing to be able to monitor for because we are seeing this with whatever frequency and we know that we need to be able to treat this. I will say that for some of you, number one is that this is still an incredibly rare condition. So it's not as if, your doctors, whoever they are, you're probably their only patient with GRIN2B. And that's another reason why we're trying to sort of put our collective heads together, is that if we can make recommendations to them based on the evidence about what they should be doing, I hope that they'll be able to do things like for insurance companies, what we call peer-to-peer reviews, be able to say, here's the evidence, here's the justification for why we need to do this, and for us to be able to supply them with data to say, this is why we need to do this, this is how frequently we're seeing, and these are what the complications can be. So the more that we can, again, aggregate these data, I hope it'll be the evidence that we need to get your kids the right care that they need. Okay. Anything else, either Jennifer or Lindsay, that you're seeing that we should address before we go on? And again, if we haven't gotten to all the questions, certainly write in. We're glad to even have, a list of questions and answers that we can distribute to the group afterwards.
There's one question. Do you know anything about treatment, loss of function with D-serine?
So with this, in terms of the D-serine, there are some other reasons why I in particular have been thinking about D-serine because there's some other conditions. I don't know of any effective way to treat GRIN2B yet with D-serine. Serine is an amino acid, and it also is a precursor for neurotransmitters within the brain. So and I won't go into all the details here, but in brief, I don't know that that's going to be an effective strategy for GRIN2B in particular. And for whoever that was, I'm glad to speak with them offline about this or email with them offline. But it's a complicated question and a complicated set of biochemistry.
Okay, Amala, because we're actually planning on trying the D-serine, and we agreed on that with our neurologist. So I was just wondering if you would be interested in that, whatever comes out with the trial, and the reason we chose to do that was I read a paper on a child from Barcelona where they actually treated the child with D-serine for a little over a year and had great success. So I asked our neurologist if that was a possibility, and we'll be doing a lot of testing and to get a baseline before we actually started it. Just as a side note, if you would be interested in that information.
Very good. So I would just ask you, either for you or for other families that are doing things, I know this is hard to do and it just requires a lot more organization on your side, but if it would be very helpful for all of us to learn from your experience, if you do it, just keep a detailed diary or keep detailed sort of notes about what happens when you start the treatment, as much as you can tell if there's something that you're measuring change for, whether it be seizures or other things. Just monitoring that for yourself, and it can just be something relatively simple. But I do think I can say we'll be very interested to see what happens for other families that may be listening in. I don't think this is a harmful treatment. In other words, I don't think there's a lot of risk that goes with that. So I can understand why you might be trying it. I don't know if it's going to work. So I am interested in seeing this, and I think it's all of us, like I said, just paying attention and trying to gather as much evidence as we can when folks try new medications, try different things.
Okay, great. We'll keep you updated then.
Okay, super. Okay.
Wendy, there's one more. Sorry. A couple people are interested if there are any deletions that are on the list today of variation.
So at least to my knowledge, and I'll go back and double check this because of the question, there are two ways that I think of in terms of deletions. So there are deletions that take out either part or all of the GRIN2B gene. None of the ones that I've listed today had deletions, either partial or complete gene deletions. It is possible, though, for individuals to have deletions of 12p13, which is the address where GRIN2B lives, and to have at least overlapping symptoms. Sometimes it can be more than what the families with just GRIN2B have, but to have something like this. And so I apologize, I didn't go into a lot of detail, but if there are folks interested afterwards, we can talk about this offline. Okay, very good. So we're going to switch gears. You heard from Barbara a little bit earlier today, but Barbara is an extremely experienced educator. She's a board-certified behavioral analyst and director of education behavioral outreach at Geisinger's Autism and Developmental Medicine Institute, close to us in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. She has extensive experience in special education, serving many different capacities over the course of her career, including both being a classroom teacher and administrator, educational consultant, behavioral analyst, and research associate for clinical trials. She frequently presents at both local and national conferences and is incredible and provides consultation and training on strategies to support students with neurodevelopmental disorders, including intellectual disabilities, developmental delays, and autism spectrum. And Barbara, we are just so thrilled to have you on, I know it's a weekend time, shortly before the U.S. holiday of Thanksgiving, so we know it's a busy time of year, but we are really grateful to have you share your wisdom with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. And just unmute yourself if you're still on mute. I saw the slide switch, and I'm hoping, Barbara, if you're talking, at least I can't hear you. The question about, can anyone hear Barbara?
Unmute.
Lindsay, Jennifer?
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay,
Perfect.
very good. I had use my phone, and you know what I'm saying. I was unmuting my phone, but I didn't unmute my screen. All right. Well, thank you for your welcome, and I'm very excited to be here today. And I've been listening to the families, and it's given me some more background information. The title that I've called my presentation is really the ABCs of effective strategies to support behavior and learning, because I find that, you know, behavior and learning are really not that easily separated, because, you know, your behavior represents what you've learned, and it's your communication. So just to start off, I just wanted to go through is that, you know, what does ABA stand for? Because we hear these alphabet letters of ABA very frequently today. And A stands for applied, meaning the interventions we use should be used for individuals in their natural settings and target behaviors that have significance for this person's social and day-to-day living. The behavioral is the B, which stands for the interventions that are based on sound behavioral principles, and analysis means we really make decisions and change our therapeutic interventions based on ongoing data collection. ABA is not just for special education, and ABA is not just one program. It's more of like a toolkit that has many, many tools inside of it. ABA is not just for schools or therapy settings. So if you think of Weight Watchers or smoking cessation programs or bonus programs at work, they are based on positive reinforcement, and oftentimes these are based on behavioral principles as well. Behavior, and now as a behaviorist, when I go into a school or do a consult, oftentimes, you know, of course, people are going to bring to my attention the behaviors that are challenging, but when we really come right down to it, behavior is not all bad. When you think of it, the behaviors on the left side are the behaviors that we really want to see. You point to an object or a picture. You take an adult's hand to a desired item. You might hand a picture to an adult or follow directions. Washing your hands is a behavior, reading a story. However, that being said, what we often see when we talk about behavior, bringing in a behavior specialist, is we see the behaviors of screaming or yelling or crying rather than talking, putting things in mouth, destroying materials or swiping things off a table, jumping up and down, pushing things away, running or spinning objects. These are the behaviors oftentimes that may be challenging, including for some others could be even an aggression or self-injury. Now, I always like this one because it reminds me of a little boy that I supported as a behavior specialist in the home and school, and he was very naive and innocent, and it was like, do you see anything? And so I wasn't even looking. I thought we were both in timeout. So I always find that it's very important for us to realize that many times we know the behaviors we want our children and or students to engage with. However, that being said, the children don't sometimes know what we exactly want. So behavior, what is behavior? Behavior is caused and it's observable, meaning it's something that we see on the outside. That being said, anxiety and hunger and thirst even are internal behaviors, but we see something on the outside that might give us the hint that there's a behavior underneath it that is there. Behavior is what's very important is communication. It communicates what the person wants or needs or is trying to access. It serves a function, and that's the why, which is very important. We have to figure out, why does the person do a certain behavior? That's one of the things as a behavior specialist, I need to put on my, put on my glasses and really take a good look and try to figure this out. Challenging or problem behaviors, though, that's oftentimes, like I said, what I'm brought in for, but the function's not usually the problem. So if I'm thirsty, there is nothing wrong with my needing water, but the problem is if I take the water out of your hand or if I take, someone else's drink. Oftentimes some children that have a limited repertoire of behaviors may use the same behavior for different functions, to get something, to get away from something. So sometimes we have to be careful to not just quick to judgment why a person's doing a certain behavior. What's difficult for me is when my student is not learning because people are having really addressing too many problem behaviors. So if it's interfering with learning new skills, so for example, I had a young boy that was sucking his thumb. Now, when we were trying to have him talk, thumb sucking was an interfering behavior. So in that case, in that situation, we needed to try to work on that during speech time at least. What's really difficult is when challenging behavior isolates the learner. So I want the students that I work with as a teacher or a special ed supervisor or the behaviorist, I want my student to be as included and accepted with his or her peers and family as possible, and in the future in their jobs. So what oftentimes a behavior specialist is brought in is to do something called a functional behavior assessment, or an FBA. And at that time, what the person's supposed to do is develop, it's usually a behavior specialist, it can be a school psychologist, oftentimes the teacher or the school team are brought in around this as well, and of course the family's input as well. So what we try to do is really come up with a hypothesis. What is a challenging or inappropriate behavior? We need to describe it very carefully. What might be the function? Why do we think the person's doing this? And what might be the strategies to prevent, or they call them antecedent strategies. Also is very important is you just don't, if a behavior is working for you, so if I'm hungry or thirsty and I grab food and get it really quickly, I have to find a strategy for an alternate or a replacement behavior because that was working for me. So what I need to do now is to find an alternate appropriate replacement behavior. You don't just get rid of something, you need to find something appropriate to replace it with. And what we also very importantly look at are consequences that will not maintain those inappropriate behaviors. So, I always think about, the child in the checkout line, and as a behaviorist, it's interesting because I've had my own children. I always say, even with my typical children, it's very easy when you are the teacher in a school setting to be distanced from this behavior of a child that's protesting or requesting. But what happens is if the child is saying, "Mommy," or "Teacher, give me this," and then they say, "Oh, no, no, no." But then at the last minute, they give into that. Well, what that's happening then is that's maintaining that inappropriate behavior. So these consequences, we have to think of what is happening after the behavior that is maintaining those behaviors. Sorry, I went back once. This is advancing too quickly there. Well, when we have an FBA, the outcome is a behavior plan or an intervention or a treatment plan. It's very many of the strategies are developed by a team. What's very important to me, and especially with you families as you're going forward too, is that FBA should include and identify medical conditions. So low tone, if a person is having seizures, if a person is on medications, these are all very, very important conditions that will help the underlying understanding possibly of some of the behaviors. So we also want to, of course, figure out what are the positive reinforcers for that child or adult. We want to also identify environmental changes that could minimize those triggers. There's just so many hours in the day, and if we were trying to teach a child, we might want to minimize some triggers so that we can really maximize our instruction time. The important thing is to do some data collection and analyze it and try to figure out if what you're doing is working. And if it's not working, then we go back to the drawing board and we make some revisions. Or sometimes in the beginning, we give reinforcement every time the child says a word or points to something. And then over time, we have to step back and not give reinforcement at all those occasions, but we will give it more intermittently. When we think about behaviors, there's a function of a behavior, and generally in life, ourselves included as well as your children, we do things to get something, to gain something, whether it be attention or objects, activity, or to gain something sensory, so sensory seeking behavior as well. The other side of the coin, so those are the ones that we're trying to gain. The other side of the coin is the escape or avoidance, so we're trying to get rid of things. We don't want the attention, and that happens more, we see with some children potentially that have autism spectrum disorder. They're not as likely to be reinforced by the attention at times. So some people do not want attention from others as much as others. Really an escape from objects or an activity, or escape from sensory. So we think about those are the behaviors oftentimes when you're trying to get rid of things or escape or avoid them. That's more often the time we will see some negative behaviors or challenging behaviors. We often think about the ABCs of behavior. That's what's often mentioned. And so A is the antecedent, as I mentioned. Then you have B is your behavior, what you're seeing on the outside. And C is the consequence, or what happened after the behavior. So we think of this ABC. Antecedents, as I mentioned before, that's what happened right before the behavior. Or sometimes it can be a slow trigger, but what triggered that behavior? Was it a person, a place, activity, sound, a smell? Is it a specific request or demand? As I said before, slow triggers, sometimes we have a culminating effect. So the day starts and we're all fresh, but as the day goes on, there might be some other things so there might be a delay in processing or a culmination of effects. What's very important when I'm doing an FBA, as I mentioned before, is to understand, especially if there's a known genetic condition where I might have some like input and understanding that there's children that may be having some seizure activity. We have medications that are being taken. Is there poor sleep? Low tone and constipation is one that's very difficult for many of our students, as is GERD. It's often difficult for an adult to describe those feelings. So for our children, it may be even more challenging. Then we think of the behavior, which is the outside, the response, what we see, and it should be something that's observable and recordable, and we really take some data on that. C is the consequences, and that's what happened after the behavior. And consequences, I have to say, are not all bad. What it is that they happen after the behavior. So if you're getting a treat or if you're getting a reward or a sticker, that happens after the behavior. But it also includes corrective feedback, which you can say, great, right, good job, high five, praise, or no, not quite, wrong, it isn't. Those are all corrective feedback as well. So the consequences. Where we think about, and also when I'm doing these behavior plans, is reinforcement. And if reinforcement's working, behaviors should be increasing. So attention can be reinforcing, or stickers or tokens, rewards, a toy or a game, access to those. But also what can be reinforcing is escape. If every time I cry, you remove something that I didn't want to do, it reinforces me to cry the next time I see that same activity. Or if avoidance works and I turn away from you, I don't listen, I walk away, what sometimes happens is that becomes reinforcing as well, because that means the behavior is still increasing. Here I mentioned again, consequences are not all bad. Now, a child's interest to me is a starting place. So we all have various things that we might like, and what I might do is, if a child has a more restricted interest or it's something a little bit less usual, I try to then morph it into something more appropriate. So in the beginning, if a child likes ceiling fans or they like string or different things, I try to then take pictures of those things and maybe find books about those things and trying to kind of change and shift and shape the child over to liking things that might be related to those things without reinforcing constant either playing with a string or looking at fans. The reinforcers are very individual. No two children are alike, and it's important to do a preference assessment, and there's some really good documents available on how to do that. So you offer two things and see which one the child chooses, and then you have it organized and systematically to say, oh, well, he prefers a ball versus a train, but if the train's not available, he's going to prefer a bike. So those things are available, and I'll have resources for you afterwards. Once again, too, I know this is a very wide audience. I have my email address on the PDF of the slides that Lindsay's going to share the handouts with you. And if you have other questions, I would be available, but it's a wide range of an audience. I also think about different children have different other reinforcers, and maybe we can take objects or we can make Legos. Sometimes it's Beyblades. It depends on the child. The other thing that people talk about, and I'm not necessarily as advocating it, but I wanted to just mention, is punishment. And that means it's something that happens after the behavior that decreases the future of the behavior. And things like simple correction, no, overcorrection, doing something over again, restitution, meaning putting things back the way they were. Timeout, if it's is not a place, but timeout would be if the person is wanting your attention, then the no attention to that child at that moment or a few minutes is timeout from attention. So if any of these procedures work, or a response cost, meaning you have a token but then you lose that token, if these things are working, then the behavior should decrease. And that would mean that the punishment was effective. I'm not advocating corporal punishment or spanking, but that is a family decision at times. As a behavior specialist, the parents say that that's the behavior they choose to do, and I just say as a teacher or a school person or a behaviorist, I'm not going to be doing those procedures. The interesting thing is, having worked with the family, we go back to the drawing board and say, is this working? And I think that that's important to keeping some data, just as you're doing with seizures or learning, or how many words your child's learning, is to see if what you're doing is effective. So I had a parent and the mom was removing the child's dessert. He didn't get his dessert, and I said, now is he still not fighting with his sister? She said, no, he's still fighting as much. So she said, I guess it's not effective punishment. So we talked about that as well. The ABCs of behavior here in this slide, what we're saying is that generally speaking in schools, and the orientation is for us as individuals is often to do the consequences, which could be the reward or the inaccessibility of a reward. But the emphasis really, I feel, is very critical, is on antecedents. If you are setting the child up, I call it setting the stage for success. Really do like to do some things to help with setting a child up to succeed. So I'll go through a few of these activities, and then I will entertain some questions as well. I thought just given my basic information of understanding your GRIN2B, some of the challenges may be with children with developmental delay or intellectual disability are social skills challenges, which really are, when you think of it, social skills. In order to be efficient in a social skill setting, you need to understand the play skills. You need to have motivation that you want to interact with other students or children. Restricted interest can interfere with or could be a challenge. If you have some difficulty with language or getting social cues, or your speech intelligibility, all of those things are, in effect, can be interfering or challenging for social skills. If you have a very brief attention span and another child comes up to you and wants to stay on a task with you and you walk away, that may interfere with the social skill challenge. So all of these things, and your organization, when you get into higher level order games, that takes more organization. So all of these things can be worked on as a teacher, therapist, or a parent to help set the person up to be able to have success in social skill arena. So what I wanted to do was I picked a few activities and what strategies I might use for those areas that I thought might be relevant to the group today. And so I'll just start with a few, and then I'll have time at the end. So social skills. So if I want to increase appropriate social interaction with peers, sometimes I take favorite characters who act out scenarios of, it's my turn, your turn. I might set up a lunch bunch in a school setting. Sometimes the speech therapist or social worker or guidance counselors have worked with a lunch bunch. So they may take the child that has some challenges and invite a few other kids, and they sit and they take turns during lunch and model those appropriate interactions during a lunch with others. You might want to realize you need to practice and role play all the roles. So sometimes I've had children be more successful when they were being the teacher for me. So I was the child in the bus and I wasn't sitting in my seat. So I had my student be the bus driver and tell me how to sit back, sit in. And so that can be fun with children, is practicing and role playing. What's really important to me, though, is you don't teach a person to swim, in the locker room. You really need to teach a person to swim in the pool. So real-time support and feedback. So when I've done consults in schools and such, I really feel that at lunch and recess are the times that you can really do, and/or push-in therapists can go into the classroom during indoor recess even, or during gym, different activities, and giving that real-time support and feedback and the appropriateness, and just saying, that was great the way you took turns during that game. Social stories, and I'll give you a resource list at the end. That social stories are a really nice way to help with some children if they're written at child level, and they might address some of these difficult social settings for the child. Video modeling has been very effective, and I sometimes said, there's some programs, but oftentimes I find that video modeling done by myself or my staff has been very effective. In the schools, it's a little bit more limited because of HIPAA and such with other students, FERPA. But video modeling, there are some programs for that as well. Here's a group that I did some social. These 4 children had been approved to work with each other. So when we did some play dates, we really had to plan and structure them. You need to have the just right timing. I found it very helpful to include a snack, a healthy snack. What we often did was made a list together in the beginning so that each person, there was something for everyone. And we did some social engineering. So we might have some children from the school, some from the community. In the beginning, I would potentially work with the family, and then we monitor but don't hover. I'd say an hour and a half is usually just right amount of time with young 8 to 10-year-olds. When you get to the middle school, high school level, oftentimes you're going to look towards like either community events or bowling lanes, coffee shops. Volunteer opportunities are a nice way sometimes for social skills for some of our young adults, and or community centers. For the communication target, I would say, I would really want a child to communicate rather than run away or resort to aggression or shut down. Communication can be verbal, gestural, sign language, picture exchange, assistive technology device. Communication is getting your message across to the other person. All of us need a way to protest or request. That is critical for having appropriate behaviors. So often we look at functional communication training, and some of the other strategies are that the parent or the staff note that the sign that the child is getting excited, Bill, or is misunderstanding. So at that point, it's really an important time to interrupt it, engage the person in the appropriate communication, and reinforce it. Let's prevent, teach, reinforce. Practice and reinforce these skills during various times and places with many adults during the day. So I've had children that I work with in the home, and the child would communicate with me and or the parent, but then we had to help generalize that to other people. So I had a young boy that was toilet trained, and the school said he was still having toileting accidents at school. And what it was that he didn't know that he had to, he would look at me and would ask me to go to the bathroom, or his parent, or at home, but he didn't know that we had to teach him to ask at school. There are various types of augmentative or alternative communication. So there's unaided, like when you can point to things. You can use your facial expression or vocalization, they call it, or you can teach actual sign language. So those are unaided forms of communication, or augmentative, alternative communication. But then you also have many of the aided devices, and that would be its own actual, probably an hour at least or two of a presentation. But if you're thinking about various types of AAC, because I did note that many of the children had some speech and language concerns in addition to the developmental delays, so I wanted to just share this with you because there's a lot of confusion, and so many people think, oh, everyone needs an iPad or such, but there's low tech, meaning you use pencil and paper or picture boards or picture exchange communication through to a single message or a voice output. That red button is like a MAC switch that might say, I need help, or is it take a walk, or single words. It could be generated with a touch of the switch, or some of these other devices that have a display and the person actually touches on them, and with going all the way through to high tech or iPad and other high tech devices. Some children do better with low tech, others with higher tech. It's most important to match it to the child, and it might be they use different systems for different settings. I always think about one that's very difficult for many of the children that I've worked with, and it's transition. And when I step back and really think transition, you think everything in life is a transition. There's place to place, activity to activity, there's person to person, preferred to non-preferred, and there's activity, place, person, all this complication, all these different ways that a person can transition during the day. And I've had students that even had difficulty going from one preferred to another because you're stopping one thing and starting another. Some of the strategies I've used and very effective, I find, for many people, and myself, I've used many different varieties of a visual schedule. For some, it's the actual items, or some it's pictures, photos, along with the printed words. I always try to reach it up to a higher level so that, I'm always anticipating the next level with the student. So having the printed word can be also a nice way of pairing the word with the picture of the item. Of course, in the beginning, you need to assess, does the person actually recognize, and do they like to see themselves in pictures? That's been very helpful as well. For transition, I've also used jobs to assist the person to move in the hallway or come in the classroom. Some children have a difficulty. They love their home and they love the school, but going from the bus to the schoolroom is difficult. So creating a real job that gets the person to go. Sometimes it could be transition between classes. So that's where your visual schedule can be very helpful. Preferred items or fidget toys as distractors is very much on an individual basis. Some children like to take something with them as long as it's not distracting and it stays with the child. I feel that in the beginning they can just then put it in their pocket, or we try to keep it as small as possible if that would help the person transition. Sometimes taking a ball to the gym helps the child understand, oh, I'm leaving my one class, I'm going to gym, so they could bring an actual ball to the gym class. Nonverbal cues such as a sign language can be very helpful, or pointing to the schedule, because it is over time we want to be able to have people more independent and being able to understand their own schedule. So the child might ask, am I going to gym next? Is it time for lunch, or is it time to go home? First time I might answer, then I might use a manual sign, or I can just point to the schedule that's right there. Pre-specified reinforcers, so the person knows that this is coming, it's right in front of them. So maybe what I would do is I'm having a child that's doing something that's a little more challenging, such as maybe doing some dressing skills, and because of poor fine motor, it's a more challenging activity. So in front of the person, I may have a small container with a toy in it that they know they're going to get. It's right there. Is a promise reinforcer. 2-minute warnings, even those of us who don't understand 2 minutes, which I should have asked Lindsay about, to give me a 2-minute warning, is even if we don't understand the exact numbers of minutes, that idea tells us something is happening, something is going to change. Rehearse change-ups. The difficult thing is in life, there's a lot of times that we have our schedule, but there might be a change-up, such as a substitute, or it snows and there's no school that day. So we have to rehearse those as well. Here's some different schedules. As I mentioned before, you can have an object schedule with the actual, I've had actual like piece of the ball, a cup, and chapstick and such, versus here we have drawings, as I mentioned before. The physical structure of the room oftentimes is very helpful to help people to understand what's expected of their behavior. So elementary classroom to me is always, or preschool shows you exactly where you're supposed to read a book. You see the books, you see the kitchen area, you see toys or mat or rugs. as you get into the upper grades, some of our students have difficulty because the room is much more not differentiated. So, oh, I don't understand that. I read in this section, and in the other area I do partners. These are some schedules that I've used, and what I've done is that sometimes I've I've gone to Staples and I've gotten color-coded like little stickies, and this was for like a high school girl, and so each color was a different subject in her day, because she wanted to be just like her teacher or her parent, so we can grow up these schedules.
There's a GRIN2B thing.
Hello? Following directions. There are some activities and strategies for you here. And I'm not sure if Lindsay. Okay, I'm not sure if I was getting. Did anyone have a specific question? It says, can you hear?
I think we just have somebody that's not muted right now. I think that's the noise that you're hearing.
Okay. Oh, okay, good enough. Yeah. Just making sure. I didn't need to answer. Okay, very good. So basically another area parents and staff are often asking me about is how to get people to follow directions, and once again, those visual supports. Practicing with positive requests. So if you know your child likes to do certain things, you could do it's called like behavioral momentum, get them to practice positive directions. You know, sometimes it's like, you know, let's pick up your cookie. That's a positive request, isn't it? Or let's blow some bubbles together. You know, pick up the bubbles, pick up your toys, and let's give the dolly a kiss. Allowing for a possible delay in response or an initial negative response, that sometimes happens with children, and I think that we have to understand that and give the actual amount of time. Some children take longer if you have lower tone and you maybe don't access and move as quickly. So we really have to be sure that the person, we're giving adequate time for the person to follow our requests. Sometimes I've learned some manual sign language that can be very helpful for some children. Asking a person, can you help with? Oftentimes children like to help, especially when they're younger, and that's something we always have with us. One of the things I found is oftentimes if it's a difficult demand, have the preferred adult place that demand on the person, or in the school sometimes what I've had is during fire drills, I had one child that really had a difficulty with it, so I would have one of my staff that was a very highly preferred staff be there at the door to help walk outside to the fire, when we had a fire drill, and he would really follow along with that adult. It was more powerful. Reinforce following directions, and for some kids we have the humor. I had one little girl that didn't like to clean up, but she laughed when I'd say, clean up your palace, princess. So she would laugh, and it was our little thing that we had going, and it's like a social story. We laughed about cleaning up palaces. High probability, that was, I was mentioning before, if you know there's two things the person would do, you get the person to follow, you know, let's give your doll baby a kiss, let's pet the puppy, let's go and get our backpack and line up, you know, or get your shoes on, we're going to go to school. Feed the class pet and get your folder. Schedules are useful for seeing the sequence of things, not necessarily in the beginning of teaching it. You need to really teach it first. However, later on, you might, then you have the ability to visualize it. In the interest of time, I think what I'll do is I'm going to just go quickly through this one, but I do want to give some time for people if there's questions. Let me just, this one, the one I was thinking of is very helpful is which one do you want to do first? So if you have two tasks that the person needs to do, sometimes it's nice to feel that you have a choice. And another that I felt with task completion was important is many children who have attention deficit or are younger children only hear the initial part of what we're saying. So can I go on the computer, or can I have my cookies? And you might say, no, you can't have your cookies until after dinner. All they heard was no, or it's not time for computer. So if you put in the forefront what you want the child to hear, which is you will play on the computer after we finish math, or you will have cookies after dinner, you're really helping the person understand and not that reinforce the actually finishing what they're doing. 80-20, 80% easy, 20% hard tasks. Adult attention, when you want a person to complete a task, sometimes the adult in proximity or collaboration, many times with homework. As a behaviorist, or what I would do is try to help the parent and suggest maybe sit and do your paperwork or balance your checkbook, or sit at the table, not necessarily doing the activity with your child, but it's like almost like a collaboration because you're in proximity, but you're available as well. Reinforcing when the task is complete is important. Timers are not for everyone, but today with our, there's a lot of really good technology with timers, with the iPad, the iPhone, but it depends on the individual. What can you do differently? I always think about communicate effectively, my voice and my tone. I always try to be at the person's comprehension level, not too far above, not below their level. Really learn about what items the person likes and talk about those things. And really, because we need to, it's almost like I have in my savings account with you. I need to know what I know about you so that I can help you through some things that might be more challenging. Having those reinforcers available, minimizing known triggers, especially if I'm trying to teach and learn something that's more challenging, using those visual supports. Challenges for parents or staff are often the behaviors that are automatically reinforced. So some children who engage in some self-stim or some self-injury, it's more difficult to interrupt those behaviors. Difficulty for children who aren't learning as well from their consequences, and that's why I always talk about that shift to the antecedents first, because we can practice the appropriate behaviors if we can get to them. Addressing inappropriate behaviors that are used to request or protest. So that's where I talked earlier about that functional communication training. You really need to teach a person to request and the ability to protest. Finding some appropriate reinforcers is harder for some children than others. These are some strategies that I pretty much have kind of discussed as we went through. This will be in your handout. This one I think is very important. Whenever possible, offer choices. We all like choices. Limit it to 2, not too many. Offer and teach a person to request a break. Reinforce the behaviors you want to increase. It's not always what you say, but how you say it. I always think you can control your environment, your responses. And don't underestimate the value of calm. I've found that very helpful over these years. Here are some resources for you, and that'll be in your handout for making schedules and checklists or doing those social stories as well. So I would like to now offer some time for some questions. Lindsay, if you have some, I can take them. I know that there have been people scrolling through, but I was trying to concentrate on my presentation.
I'm just going to take control back of the mouse, Barb.
Okay, very good. Am I moving them too much? Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the first question, well, not the first question asked, but the first one on the screen. One of the participants, OT, has been working a lot with their daughter about sensory processing. And there have been a couple of questions here about, like dealing with children who are low in pain tolerance or hyposensitive.
And I think that, I say that the OT was working on some responses, and I think that what happens is it could be like desensitization to some things. For some, if they're hypersensitive, they're overly sensitive to something. So gradually introducing. I've had some children who've actually didn't like many foods, would gag, and actually to touch food or to see it on a plate. So gradually working on it, but some things is not hurrying it, or some of the more difficult things are oftentimes haircuts, going to the dentist, and so social stories, some desensitization, going to the barber shop or the beauty parlor before it opens, really systematically working through some of those things, but always in the beginning trying to figure out, what are the antecedents and what are the reinforcers for the person. So sometimes we can do things when we're more motivated for the other person, or when we have a more powerful reinforcer coming afterwards. So it's like when you see that you're near the finish line, you seem to get that surge of energy. Also, I think that sometimes having another person to help work through it with the parent has been very helpful, whether it's the child, going to like a dentist or the doctor. There's a history of crying or throwing up in the parking lot because they're so anxious. So having a different person there available to help keep calm and carry on with the parent is oftentimes in the beginning helpful. Taking photographs of the actual dentist office, maybe even without the child there, can be helpful. When the child is hypo, I've had some children that who have less feeling in their hands, and we had to be very careful because we had to really adjust the heat in the sink in the student's bathroom as well, and we had to teach that was hot because they didn't feel the sensation of hot. So those are some of the things that we would do, is that the hypo versus hyper. Does that answer some of those questions?
I think, Barb, as far as like the sensory stimulation earlier on in the thread, I don't see them right now, but there were some parents asking about how to help their child stop biting their hands and their wrists, sometimes even sticking their hands down their throat to make themselves, throw up, that kind of thing, which is all related to what you were just talking about.
Right, and I think that parts of that would be also finding things that are manipulatives that are very powerful, interrupting it, seeing where is the times that those behaviors occur the most. And if you, as a parent, or I know as a teacher or as a therapist, there's something that we either hear in the child's voice, either the way they cry differently or a comment that's made. I had one little girl who would say, "I quit." And that meant she was very upset. She just wanted to quit. And then the next thing would be her hand would be in her mouth. So at that moment, I have heard that, and I can quickly interrupt and find something that's more powerful to play with or manipulate. Sometimes it's not giving a lot of visual attention, because whether attention is attention, and if the child likes attention, that has to be figured out as well firsthand. But it could be that the attention we're giving to those behaviors is inadvertently also reinforcing it. So they may be getting something sensory from it. However, in addition, they're getting some attention from us. So I oftentimes be cautious not to give too much of my eye contact if the child is doing something such as even head banging and such. I had a child that would head bang and then stop and look over. Also head bang, would put their hand down and just watch to see how, so you really need to step back though, because some of the behaviors, like, can be very, you don't want the child to hurt themselves if they don't have a good sense of the pain threshold.
It looks like there's a couple questions as well on the various, so some about social stories for older kids or more complex situations, and then the corollary is the strategies for kids with a very young developmental age, like under a year old. And I saw that you had some references. I thought one was like gray social stories.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I've done social stories for fairly, for the little boy that would throw up. He would actually throw up when he went to he threw up a lot, I guess, now that I'm thinking of it, when things were, when he got too upset, anxious about something. So haircuts were one of them. So what it was I actually did a picture social story without many words. And, would just say, scissors go snip, 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 and show a picture of scissors or show a picture of scissors cutting paper. And then we would look at this together, and then we would look at it right before we went into the barber shop when no one else was there other than us. So that was a child that I would say he was at about a 1.5, 2-year level. It was very basic through to some very, I've done it with some children that didn't understand concepts such as mind your business. And so what we did was we actually used, this was for a 10, 12-year-old, and so what we did, she didn't understand when a person said, mind your business, so we actually used her American Girl dolls and had them act out a scenario together, and so you can really customize it. I've had it with a young man who was older and didn't understand when people would always ask him questions about himself, and he really didn't like to answer those questions, and we worked on how to answer a person without going into great detail. So it can be used a whole range, and sometimes when the kids are older, you do more of a comic strip social story. Carol Gray has a lot of terrific examples on the website. There's also a very, I guess about a $30 app you can use on your iPad to create social stories. The nice thing about social stories is they're more the printed or pictured, and it can help a child see things through another person's eyes and understand it more readily. And so oftentimes they're much less emotionally charged, and it should be done at the time when you're not in the heat of the moment, but as just a natural part of using it frequently and naturally as a book or a story. And many of my children really have liked to use them and really revisit them.
Okay, great. I just want to be mindful of time for everyone. And there's one more question I think that might be helpful is, what is the appropriate age to have a functional behavioral assessment done? And is this done through the school, or can it be done privately?
It can be done privately and or through the school. Generally, it really could be done at any age. It's just a matter of what is the challenging behavior. Like I said, if the person, and trying to figure out why is the person doing this behavior, what are the antecedents, what are the underlying reasons. A young child that was pushing into his stomach quite a bit, and is this because he's got constipation? So we would eliminate by looking at it. We did like we had him go get an X-ray to make sure he wasn't impacted, ruling out the medical pieces, trying to figure out what those behaviors are. So if FBA can be done at really any age, I believe, it's just a matter of really analyzing and trying to figure out what the behavior is, what is the function and what is maintaining that behavior, and being creative oftentimes to think of ways to interrupt that behavior and reinforce what you want to see. Because you said you don't just get rid of something that's been working for a person. I had a little boy that's obsessed with opening and closing doors to the point where he doesn't want to leave a store. He just wants to stand at the door opening and closing. So initially his behavior specialist is, because he's getting very big, he's a big 8-year-old, and so his behavior specialist created a little video of a door opening and closing. So if he goes through the threshold and gets into his car, he can see that video. So you have to think out of the box sometimes and be creative, because your intervention is just as important as figuring it out.
Okay, great. So we're at 4:05. I know we wanted to give the families time to talk amongst themselves too. I don't know, Wendy, if you wanted to make any kind of closing comments before we wrap up. And I want to thank Barb so much for providing this, and then we'll also make the slide set available to everybody.
Yeah, no, this is Wendy again. I just wanted to thank everyone who's done everything to make all of this possible. Lindsay's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, Jennifer as well, and again, Barbara, for everything you did. As we're doing this, like I said, this is just the first foray into this. These things get better and better as we get to know everyone and what the needs are, so definitely give us feedback. And we're going to drop off the line, but like I said, we're going to keep the line open for an hour now for anything you guys want to talk about amongst yourselves. If there are things we didn't have time to get to today, we'll try and send around Q&A in terms of what we know. We'll post these slides, and again, if there's other things that come up for discussion, please send us a note afterwards. Lindsay perhaps is the best person to channel these through, because I think she's been in touch with sending folks announcements on this. And like I said, if there are things that you want to hear about more, whether we do this again in a year or 6 months or something else, give us feedback, let us know. We're glad to do what we can to try and support the families going forward. So anyway, thanks everyone. Thanks again for sharing your weekend with us. We hope this weekend time worked well, but if there are other suggestions, let us know, and we'll try and get some feedback from you guys in an organized way. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.